often say, I've said it in talks I've done before, where, women have had a revolution, like you said, of them, an expanded understanding of the roles that they can fulfill in society. And it's just expanded and taken up more space. And not necessarily that it's squeezed men, because I don't think it's squeezed. They almost live on two different continuums. As I'm saying this, I can think of it's like two bars where you have a graph where there'd be like kind of two bars meeting, and this side being pink and this side being blue. And a lot of people would probably think that it's on the same path. So if feminism is moving women and it's squeezing men, but it's not. They're on two different sides, and women have gone, oh, great, and advocate for themselves and filled up a lot of this bar, and men's bars have stayed exactly the same or shifted a little bit, because I think there's more conversation now. And it's all this gap where there's some men kind of treading into, right, fearlessly, talking about emotions and feelings and being really involved fathers and things like that, but they're still being met with a level of ridicule, some from the men still in this blue side, and some, would you say, from kind of society at large, media and so forth. Because I always think back to, and this kind of takes me to the campaign where I became aware of yourselves. I always quote this because I think it really impacted me when I saw it, and it just kind of touched me and made me angry. I think it's when Piers Morgan was taking the piss out of Daniel Craig for wearing his child in a sling, and I really went in on him on Twitter. And I always think of moments like that because I, with my kind of confidence in myself and being the man I am, I look at that and go, Piers Morgan, you're a bit of a dick. It's really unnecessary. But Piers Morgan has, I don't know how many followers on Twitter, X, whatever people call it. I'm not really a big fan on the platform. He has, millions of people would have viewed that. Millions of men would have viewed that. And they would have thought, I don't want anyone to take the piss out of me in this way. I don't want my friends to judge me in this way, right? Whether they think it consciously or unconsciously, which would stop them from ever wearing their children in a sling, And so much so, if the people, I'm almost rebellious in this way, the people that live around where I am, I take my little boy for a walk pretty much every morning, and have done since he was about 4 weeks old. So there's people around here that know me as a man who's always got his son in a sling and carrying him walking through the forest, and they talk to me and they say hello. But I always think of maybe the men who are in my NCT class or other men around who will never take that experience up because of the fear of what other people might think of them.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And it's all part of this sort of soup of culture and policy, like the kind of systemic barriers. I mean, going back to the Piers Morgan example briefly, I, funnily enough, was asked about that specific example. I was giving evidence in Parliament a couple of months ago, and they asked, what about this? My answer to that is always the same, which is, like, to be honest, I will take my cues on masculinity from James Bond and not from Piers Morgan. And so that's kind of what I like about that example is, yes, on the one hand, you've got a powerful figure ridiculing someone for carrying their baby in a sling, but on the other hand, it sort of holds up a lens of like, yeah, but this is literally James Bond and yours Piers Morgan. Like, what is masculinity here, really? Who's given me the better steer on how I should be a man? So yeah, I mean, those cultural barriers definitely do exist, and I think there's a huge amount of variability in some workforces. We hear sort of awful stories about the discrimination that people face, and for example, we did some work on the police a few months ago, because there's tons of problems with paternity leave in the police. Like, most officers can't afford to take even 2 weeks. They go back after a week, and they're sleep deprived, driving their police cars at high speed and holding tasers and guns, and it's not great for anyone. But one guy said, I took an extra 2 weeks off because my partner had a C-section. So I took my 2 weeks paternity leave. I took 2 weeks unpaid to look after her, because it takes 6 weeks sometimes for you to recover. And I went back and I was mocked. I was ostracized. People were making fun of me behind my back. He said it was one of the reasons he ended up leaving the police, because it was just, he had no support. And then in other places you hear about companies who are brilliant and cultures that entirely encourage you to be an open, active father. But like, one of the things in this that, one of the things that's so powerful about things like paternity leave is the evidence from other countries is that if you can shift some of those systemic barriers, you drive behavior change, and that behavior change drives cultural change. So you look at Iceland, for example. The Scandinavian countries tend to do paternity leave best, not surprisingly. And Iceland brought in 3 months of paternity leave in 2000. So at the time, it was the best paternity leave policy in the world. And before that, they had done what we had done. They just offered shared parental leave, and literally no one was using it. Like, there was 1 year where in the whole of Iceland, 8 men, not 8%, 8 individual men took some form of parental leave. I mean, it's not a huge country, but that's incredible. They could sort of not even form a football team together. And so they brought in this paternity leave, and then literally overnight, it went from less than 1% to 80%. And then within 7 years, you had got to a place where they track what percentage of couples share childcare equally once a child is age 3 or older. That had risen to 80%, and had been at something like 30% before they brought in paternity leave. And of course, that then drives cultural barriers. Of course, it changes the norms around how it is to parent. And I've spoken to people in Sweden who, do great paternity leave, they have for a long time, and they say it's the opposite. You are frowned upon for being active. If you didn't take your paternity leave and weren't active as a father, you're ostracized the other way. You're seen as kind of beyond the pale for not playing that role. And you can't change those things unless you change this. The policies are like literal walls in the way of cultural change. You have to knock those down before things will start to shift, because otherwise people's behavior can't change.
Yeah, people don't have the economic means or space to make those changes. And it's really interesting what you said about police, because one of my questions is like, I can think back to maybe would have been in my early career when I first started working maybe 20 years ago. And one of the guys in the office, I worked in tech for about 16 years, and he was taking paternity leave, and his boss was kind of mocking him. He was like, well, you're going on holiday? Where are you going to go on holiday? You've got these 2 weeks. What are you going to do? Put your feet up, watch a bit of TV, watch some football. And I remember thinking at that time, even as young as I was there, like, what the fuck? Come on, this is mad. But then now I talk to my friends now who, especially in the last few years, quite a few people having children, and like everyone maxing out paternity leave, but, coming up against the 2 weeks, or some people are in better company, so they get like 3 months, or I think a friend of mine was able to split the 3 months in two, take 6 weeks to start with, and then take the 6 weeks at a later date during the first year, which I think was a really beautiful system. But it is this, I do sometimes wonder, like, especially in some of these finance organizations and sales organizations where they kind of maybe they have a more kind of competition and domination culture, where ridicule and banter it has to be part of it. Men are still feeling the pressure not to take it, feeling like they can't, that it somehow is unmanly even to kind of take paternity leave.
Yeah, we definitely hear that from people, and in particularly finance, law. They're sort of well-paid, competitive, very like demanding professions are somewhere. There's the irony that they're the most likely to offer very generous paternity leave, because the competition for good staff is fierce and because they can afford it, whereas smaller businesses in other less wealthy sectors probably can't. But there are also some of the industries where people are most reluctant to take it, because they have that fear that, like, wink, wink, you can take it, but we know really, like, you're going to lose out if you do. And actually, we did some polling not that long ago that over 50% of men said, I would be worried about my career if I took my full paternity leave.
Wow.
So, it is not enough to bring in, as a company, a good paternity leave policy, pat yourself on the back, and then leave it there. You have to do all sorts of work within the organization to change your culture. And equally, this is part of why we don't think ultimately this should be up to companies to fix it. Like, there are 2 reasons for that. One is not everyone can afford it. It's too expensive for a lot of tiny companies to offer decent paternity leave. And at the moment, paternity leave is paid for by the government primarily, and it should be, continue to be. We need to make sure that it's not this sort of two-tier lottery system, which we have now, where if you work at BT, great, you get 6 months full pay. You work at, your local coffee shop, you get 2 weeks if you're lucky. So we need the government to make sure that it's fair for everyone. But also because individual businesses can only do so much to drive cultural change. They have control over people's experience within their company, but you need a society-wide systemic change in the horizons that we open up for men to play a bigger role in childcare. And you can't do that in pockets of wealthy industries here and there or good companies here and there. It has to be across the board.
Yeah, definitely. And there's something that popped into my head as you're speaking. It's somewhat collected, is actually football. Because I distinctly remember, footballers not attending the birth of their child to play a game. And it's something I feel like I've started to shift, because maybe it's something I'm really paying attention to now after I've had my own baby and been through that birthing experience, which is like kind of this, it's almost like a strange psychedelic experience. You kind of go into it and it's really intense, and you come out and you're like, oh, I have this baby with me, and oh, what just happened over the last few days? But I got no time to really think about it because I've got a baby to look after. And I guess I wonder if something that you know much about is obviously footballers don't get paternity leave. Don't get paternity leave. And even I've seen it mentioned, and I'm an Arsenal supporter, so it's something I've been noticing around Martin Odegaard and his child being born. I think it was at the back end of last year. And even the commentary sometimes has been like, oh yeah, but his form has dipped, but he did have a baby and maybe that's affecting his form, which I guess could definitely be a reason. But I guess around the footballers, like have within the sport, if it's something you notice or something you follow, the attitude around fatherhood started to shift in the sport, because I'm hearing less and less of, so I'm hearing more and more, so-and-so's not playing today because their child was born yesterday or they're about to be born.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I like, I'm a cricket fan, and I've noticed that over the last few years in cricket, it's pretty standard now. You hear like, oh, X is missing this game to attend the birth of their child, or that they've flown back from the tour of Australia to be at the birth of their child, which sounds like a kind of bare minimum, right? But you're right, like it hasn't necessarily been that way in football. And even again, I follow Formula One. And Max Verstappen, who's the sort of best, the champion, the best driver around, has just had a baby, and he's, days afterwards, he's driving a car at 200 miles an hour, risking his life. I mean, he's better than ever. He's won the last, he's been winning everything. So maybe that's the opposite. But yeah, sportsmen are in an interesting space in this. And it is wild when you think about it, that there isn't even the space to be like, okay, just miss a couple of games. We're not necessarily, maybe you don't even get the pay. Like, to be honest, I'm not that bothered whether footballers get paid or not. They get a lot of money, but like to have that space. But it reminds me of a conversation I was having the other day, actually, with someone from an organization called Dance Mama, which represents people in dance, about parenting. And she was talking about men in dance. And a lot of them are self-employed, not particularly well-paid industry. So you have lots of guys who have a baby and then are back to work like immediately. And she sort of talks about this guy who was like, he was just 4 coffees before he went out. And can you imagine trying to dance around on stage and jump and be energetic when you've like not slept at all? So I can kind of imagine how it would impact a footballer if they are playing any kind of role whatsoever in looking after the baby after they're born.
Yeah, especially if there could be all sorts of complications we don't know about, that post, first few months where, you have no idea what you're doing. Neither of you have done this before. So if you're first, you've never done this before. So every little cough and runny nose, you're like concerned and worried. Is it a fever? You're getting out that little gun thing that we have now.
Yeah.
That they put in the ear. And, if you do, your child is a bit unwell, it's going to affect you at work, and that's something that I think is really affecting the situation is the way that I think it's something you talked about earlier, is that because a mother becomes the primary caregiver, once they do go back to work, they then become the primary person for calls or sicknesses to take time off. And I guess I'm getting into the thing I was thinking about after that is like the gender pay gap, because I read Richard Reeves' book of Boys and Men, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. But and he makes a really strong case for the gender pay gap predominantly being about parenthood or motherhood, like a motherhood tax almost that is put on. Do you see paternity leave as one of the kind of antidotes to that gender pay gap?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, starting with the evidence around it, there's an analysis that countries that offer 6 weeks of paternity leave or more have a 4% lower gender pay gap. Just on that alone, there was a study in Sweden that for every extra month of paternity leave the father took, the mother's earnings over time went up by 7%. And that is because paternity leave is that, as I say, that sort of original cornerstone that cements that primary caregiver, primary breadwinner role, whether or not that's what the family wants. Because you think about it, you're there for 2 weeks or less if you can't afford that full time, and plenty of people can't. And you're just starting to get, your head round how to do this parenting thing, and you're not away, you're not sleeping. And we hear from so many people who said the first week of my paternity leave we spent in hospital because it was a difficult birth and we needed neonatal care, and then I was gone. That was it. I didn't get anything. And so after that, even, with all the best will in the world, you want to be as involved as you can be. Over time, of course, it's the mother who learns how to feed the child properly, how to change them when they're starting on solids. What do they like? What do they don't like? How do you cut stuff? Where do you keep things? And of course, the child becomes more bonded to them. So when they're unhappy, they want to go to them. And you sort of become this sort of beta parent, right, as the father. And it's very hard for that not to happen. And so when you then get to the point where you're trying to work out how do you do, we're at the end of our parental leave, we're trying to work out how we do this longer term. And you have lack of flexible working, you have incredibly expensive childcare. It would make it very difficult for both parents to juggle working fully and parenting. And so one parent has to go part-time or leave work altogether. It's almost always the mother. It's very difficult to push against those forces, even if that's never what you planned. And that starts right from the beginning. So it's crucial to bring down the gender pay gap. And it's also crucial in the sense that because we have this inequality, employers are aware that if they hire a woman aged between, say, 25 and 40, there's a good chance they will have a baby in the next few years. And for them, that means they'll be gone for a year, and there's a prejudice that if they come back, they'll have baby brain, they won't be as useful, their heads will be at home. Whereas for men, you're like, yeah, okay, if they have a baby, they'll be gone 2 weeks. It won't cost me anything, big deal. And so, employers too many employers secretly admit, I wouldn't hire a woman in that age range, or I don't promote women in that age range. And Pregnant and Screwed did research recently. It was 74,000 women a year lose their jobs for becoming pregnant. Essentially, it's not legal, but it happens. And until you make it so that it is more normal for men to play a bigger role, so that the kind of cost differential for companies is lower, that prejudice will continue to happen. And that discrimination and that sort of step back at work that women have to make when they have children and ripples out for the rest of their life. It's part of why you end up with so few women in the boardroom, because their careers are set back by a decade. And then when they retire, you have tons of women falling into pension and poverty because they stop paying in to their pensions, and so they got a tiny pension when they retire. So it's a massive problem. And yeah, paternity leave is the acorn at the core of that problem. It's not the whole solution, but it's quite hard to fix it without fixing that first.